Welcome to the Essential Southern Podcast, where we explore the rich history, culture, and traditions of the American South.
Welcome to the Essential Southern Podcast. This is your host, Brian McClanahan, and this podcast is sponsored by the Abbeville Institute. Go to abbevilleinstitute.org to help us in our mission to explore what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. All right, well, one of the things that's important about the Southern tradition, of course, is this period of time leading into the War for Southern Independence that we had secession. So secession is often counted as a Southern or considered to be a Southern position on the Constitution. And there is no better speech that articulated this position than Jefferson Davis's farewell address in 1861. Now, this speech for years was recognized as one of the most important speeches ever delivered in the United States Senate. We have to remember that when the speech concluded, people actually wept and cheered from the galleries. So this was not something that was considered to be an act of treason or something that was heretical to the United States Constitution or the Senate itself. In fact, at the time, the Senate did not expel these members. They simply left their seats vacant. So in 1861, there was a dramatically different view of secession than what we have today in 2023, when it's counted as treason to the United States Constitution. At that time, in 1861, it wasn't. And Davis is going to make the case for that in this farewell speech to the United States Senate. Now, because of time, I'm not going to read the entire thing, but I do want to highlight certain parts of the speech because, of course, they do talk about what is true and valuable in the Southern tradition. One of the things we have to remember is that not everything in every tradition is valuable. There are things in every tradition that we would say we don't want to emulate today. And that would be no different than any point in Southern history. But this speech does articulate a couple of important things. Number one, Davis makes a differentiation between secession and nullification. He does talk about nullification in this speech as a doctrine of union. And this is something that people often miss. They just simply say nullification is the grandfather of secession. That's not true. They are two different things. And Davis makes that clear in this particular speech. Even Calhoun himself made that clear during his lifetime. The other thing, of course, that he brings up is the issue of the Declaration of Independence. Now, this is something at the Abbeville Institute we are working on called the 1607 Project, Virginia First. And the idea is to rescue the Declaration, the original meaning of the Declaration, from its distortion, essentially, by the Republican Party and others in the 1850s and 60s, particularly Abraham Lincoln's Gettysburg Address. So we're going to do more of that if you go to abbevilleinstitute.org or you go to 1607project.org. You can see what we're working on there. The other thing that Davis makes clear in this particular speech is that the issues were subordinate to the issues that were contentious at the time, were subordinate to the overarching problem of power and constitutionalism. And that's also something that we miss when we talk about the 1850s and 60s. We often look at it as issue-driven and issue-specific, but there was a larger overarching problem of constitutionalism in America that really began when the Constitution was ratified in 1788, and we had the first Congress in 1789. These issues have been boiling under the surface for a long period of time and simply came to a head in 1861. So this Davis speech is one of these essential Southern documents. That's why we call this the Essential Southern Podcast. It's an essential document that you need to know if you want to understand the Southern tradition and you want to understand the Southern political tradition of decentralization. So let's get into the speech. Again, I'm not going to read everything in the speech, but I am going to read most of it. So this is January 21st, 1861. Mississippi had seceded from the Union. Davis, of course, was a proponent of secession. He said it was something that the states had the right to do, and he's going to make that case again in this speech. So he says, "I rise, Mr. President, for the purpose of announcing to the Senate that I have satisfactory evidence that the state of Mississippi, by a solemn ordinance of her people in convention assembled, has declared her separation from the United States." Now, in saying that, this is something else that is a real American tradition, but the South, of course, used in this period of time. By saying that the people of Mississippi in convention assembled have seceded from the United States, was different than the legislature of Mississippi doing that. So this was an act of the people of the state, which everyone recognized as holding the real sovereignty in the United States and the political system. Now, there were those that would say that there was one people. This goes back into different constitutional interpretations. New England would generally rely on the one people position as it gained ascendancy in the Congress because this gave them power. Southerners would often talk about the people of the states being sovereign. So each state, the people of each state were sovereign and could direct the will of that sovereignty any way they chose. And so that's where you have this issue of secession. He says, under these circumstances, of course, my functions are terminated here. It has seemed to me proper, however, that I should appear in the Senate to announce that fact to my associates, and I will say but very little more. The occasion does not invite me to go into argument, and my physical condition would not permit me to do so if it were otherwise. And yet it seems to become me to say something on the part of the state I here represent on an occasion so solemn as this. Now again, this is a solemn occasion. It's not a joyous occasion. And we often think about the Declaration, for example, as being this joyous occasion. But when that vote was taken in 1776, you could hear a pin drop. People realized what they had done, and Davis is recognizing the weight of this action because there was a real threat of war. He's going to bring that up in this speech as well, something he wanted to avoid. In fact, Davis was articulating a peaceful position. We simply want to be left alone. Don't enforce the laws because there's no laws to enforce. He's going to make this case as well. He says, it is known to senators who have served with me here that I have for many years advocated as an essential attribute of state sovereignty the right of a state to secede from the Union. And this is true. Davis was consistent. If you go back and look at Davis's speeches before the war and what Davis said after the war was over in his published works, he said the exact same thing. There's a cogency to all of it throughout his entire political career. There's nothing that Davis said early in his political career which would deviate from what Davis said late in his life when he was writing his memoirs. And so when people talk about the lost cause as a pejorative, these people were making it up and lying. They really don't have a full understanding of the entire swath of Southern history and what these people had said at all. They're making that up. Therefore, if I had not believed there was justifiable cause, if I had thought that Mississippi was acting without sufficient provocation or without an existing necessity, I should still, under my theory of the government, because of my allegiance to the state of which I am a citizen, have been bound by her action. So he said, even if he didn't think there was anything going on here, that Mississippi did not have a justifiable cause to leave the Union, he would still be bound by the action of his state because he is a citizen of that particular state. And this gets into this issue of your allegiance. Is it to your state or to the center? Citizenship to your state would be higher than citizenship to the United States, at least in 1861 is how people thought of it. And generally people thought of it that way up until after the war, when we created this kind of national allegiance. Now, there were people that were nationalists, of course, before this point. And Davis had served with distinction in the United States military. In fact, what he really wanted was a military commission, but of course he became president of the Confederacy. So Davis was a military man. His father-in-law was Zachary Taylor, president of the United States, one of the most important military officials in American history, the great hero of the Battle of Buena Vista. I mean, this is an important man with an important family. His family had served with distinction throughout American wars. He was 100% American, not a traitor to anything, but a citizen of his state and doing the will of the people of his state. And he's saying, before this, he's going to say why his state was justified to do this. He represents his state. So he's defending his state. I, however, may be permitted to say that I do think she has justifiable cause, and I approve of her act. I conferred with her people before the act was taken, counseled with them that if the state of things which they apprehended should exist when the convention met, they should take the action which they have now adopted. I hope none who hear me will confound this expression of mine with the advocacy of the right of a state to remain in the Union and to disregard its constitutional obligations by the nullification of the law. Such is not my theory. So he's saying, I don't think you can remain in the Union and disregard your constitutional obligations. Now, what's interesting about that is Calhoun would not have said you can disregard your constitutional obligations through nullification, just the unconstitutional acts of the general government. So Davis here he's saying something that's interesting. Nullification was not designed to disregard anything that was in the Constitution. And of course, by saying this, you have to understand at the time, there were northern states that he believed were violating the Constitution, constitutional obligations, and we know that slavery was a major issue by disregarding their obligations to enforce the fugitive slave laws. So Southerners were upset about that. They didn't think that that was proper and legal for the northern states to be able to do that. And so they said, look, there is a constitutional obligation of the North to enforce the fugitive slave law. Even people like Daniel Webster believe this. So nullification of your constitutional obligations is not what he wanted to do. But he says nullification and secession, so often confounded, are indeed antagonistic principles. Nullification is a remedy which is sought to apply within the Union and against the agent of the states. It is only to be justified when the agent has violated his constitutional obligation and a state, assuming to judge for itself, denies the right of the agent thus to act and appeals to the other states of the Union for a decision. But when the states themselves and when the people of the states have so acted as to convince us that they will not regard our constitutional rights, then for the first time arises the doctrine of secession and its practical application. So when it's clear that the rest of the Union will not adhere to the Constitution, then the states can start exercising secession. A great man who now reposes with his fathers and who has been often arraigned for a want of fealty to the Union advocated the doctrine of nullification because it preserved the Union. And this is Calhoun's position. He always said he was a Union man. Nullification preserved the Union because it brought these issues to a conversation and they could then address them. It was because of his deep-seated attachment to the Union, his determination to find some remedy for existing ills short of a severance of the ties which bound South Carolina to the other states, that Mr. Calhoun advocated the doctrine of nullification, which he proclaimed to be peaceful, to be within the limits of state power, not to disturb the Union, but only to be a means of bringing the agent before the tribunal of the states for their judgment. This is a 100% accurate historical statement. This is exactly what Calhoun was doing. He wanted to remain in the Union. He was not a secessionist. Calhoun talked about secession, but the secessionists of South Carolina didn't like John C. Calhoun because he wasn't sufficiently secessionist. He was always a Union man. Secession belongs to a different class of remedies. It is to be justified upon the basis that the states are sovereign. There was a time when none denied it. Well, that's pretty true when you go back into the 18th century, though when you start getting into the early 19th century, the New England nationalists started to deny that. And you did have people like James Wilson of Pennsylvania and others, even in the founding generation, would say the state sovereignty issue is hogwash. But generally, most Americans, even John Adams, as he's writing his story or his history of American constitutions and the history of constitutions in general, would call the states nations, which had distinct meaning. He says that I hope that the time may come, again, when a better comprehension of the theory of our government and the inalienable rights of the people of the states will prevent anyone from denying that each state is a sovereign and thus may reclaim the grants which it has made to any agent whomsoever. Well, that action never happened. In fact, I think we've only gotten worse today in the 21st century than it was at any time in American history when it comes to these principles of government, the theory of government. He says, I therefore say I concur in the action of the people of Mississippi, believing it to be necessary and proper, and should have been bound by their action if my belief had been otherwise. And this brings me to the important point which I wish on this last occasion to present to the Senate. It is by this confounding of nullification and secession that the name of a great man, whose ashes now mingle with his mother earth, has been invoked to justify coercion against the seceded state. And he's talking about another Carolinian, Andrew Jackson. The phrase "to execute the laws" was an expression which General Jackson applied to the case of a state refusing to obey the laws while yet a member of the Union. That is not the case which is now presented. That is not the case which is now presented. Again, that is not the case which is now presented. Mississippi is not in the Union. And Davis makes a very strong case here. He says, the laws are to be executed over the United States and upon the people of the United States. They have no relation to any foreign country. It is a perversion of terms. At least it is a great misapprehension of the case, which cites that expression for application to a state which has withdrawn from the Union. So you can't say we're going to enforce the laws of the United States when the state is no longer in the Union. This is an argument that's often made. Well, the states can't leave, so therefore we can enforce the laws. But if the laws are invalid because the state is no longer in the Union, and Davis makes a very clear case here. He says, you may make war on a foreign state. If it be the purpose of gentlemen, they may make war against the state which has withdrawn from the Union. But there are no laws of the United States to be executed within the limits of a seceded state. Even Thaddeus Stevens recognized this. He recognized this is what happened in the 1860s. A state finding herself in the condition in which Mississippi has judged she is, in which her safety requires that she should provide for the maintenance of her rights out of the Union, surrenders all the benefits, and they are known to be many, deprives herself of the advantages, they are known to be great, severs all the ties of affection, and they are close and enduring, which have bound her to the Union. And thus divesting herself of every benefit, taking upon herself every burden, she claims to be exempt from any power to execute the laws of the United States within her limits. So here's Davis saying that the Union is great. We have great benefits, we have great advantages, we have ties of affection, even with New England. We have these things. But Mississippi has decided to go its own way, and therefore I have to stay with Mississippi. This is not the speech of a fire eater. This is not the speech of a disunionist who hates the United States. And in fact, that's what we have to understand about these Southerners as they were leaving the Union. Many of them, if not the vast majority of them, didn't really want to do it and didn't think it was something that they had to do until the very end. Now, we can talk about causation, we can talk about why they wanted to, but again, Davis would say it doesn't really matter why we're doing it or if the cause was justified. If the state does it, it has the right to do it. He says, I well remember an occasion when Massachusetts was arraigned before the bar of the Senate, and when then the doctrine of coercion was rife and to be applied against her because of the rescue of a fugitive slave in Boston. My opinion then was the same that it is now, not in a spirit of egotism, but to show that I am not influenced in my opinion because the case is my own. I refer to that time and that occasion as containing the opinion which I then entertained and on which my present conduct is based. I then said, if Massachusetts, following her through a stated line of conduct, chooses to take the last step which separates her from the Union, it is her right to go, and I will neither vote $1 nor one man to coerce her back, but will say to her, Godspeed, in memory of the kind associations which once existed between her and the other states. So here's Davis laying out, look, even if I don't agree with why the state's leaving, I'm not going to coerce the state because that's not the American principle. Now, Davis does get into this argument about the Declaration of Independence. And this is where people will often peg this down and say, well, see there, Jefferson Davis is a racist. He's pro-slavery. That's true. In 1861, this is true. As were many Americans in 1861, North and South. Maybe not pro-slavery in the North as much, but certainly racists, and in the way we define the term today. They did not think that everyone was equal based on race. But Jefferson Davis makes a very strong point about the Declaration historically, And this is something that has kind of lost its way. We've taken the Declaration and that line, we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal, and we use that term equal the way that we would consider it in the 21st century. And this is the way that Lincoln started setting us up in 1863. The problem with that is that it's ahistorical. This is not what Jefferson thought about it. And Jefferson Davis is completely correct about that. Now, we look at equal today as a different kind of equal. It's equity. But we have this position of Davis in the Declaration where he makes a very strong case historically for what Jefferson actually meant by that phrase. He says that Declaration of Independence is to be construed by the circumstances and purposes for which it was made, not for which we think we can use it in the present, but the circumstances and purposes for which it was made. The communities were declaring their independence. The people of those communities were asserting that no man was born, to use the language of Mr. Jefferson, booted and spurred to ride over the rest of mankind. That men were created equal, meaning the men of the political community, that there was no divine right to rule, that no man inherited the right to govern, that there were no classes by which power and place descended to families, but that all stations were equally within the grasp of each member of the body politic. These were the great principles they announced. These were the purposes for which they made their declaration. These were the ends to which their enunciation was directed. So Davis, in doing this, is actually, he's 100% correct about this. Now, we also have to understand this issue of a state of nature, and that designation, or that differentiation between a state of nature and a state of civilization. Jefferson made this very clear, Thomas Jefferson, in his life, when he said, look, in a state of nature, you can be free and ignorant, but once you enter a state of civilization, you cannot be. And so he's quite clear that in a state of nature, you could say all men were equal in a state of nature in terms of their condition. But once they enter a state of civilization, that's something entirely different. And Jefferson himself, Thomas Jefferson himself, never advocated the positions that would be, or I should say at least, never followed through on some of his convictions about some of the things that he would be cited for. But regardless, Davis makes a pretty strong case about this position of the Declaration. And then he concludes the speech with this. He says, then, senators, we recur to the compact which binds us together. We recur to the principles upon which our government was founded. And when you deny them, and when you deny to us the right to withdraw from a government which thus perverted threatens to be destructive of our rights, we but tread in the path of our fathers when we proclaim our independence and take the hazard. This is done not in hostility to others, not to injure any section of the country, not even for our own pecuniary benefit, but from the high and solemn motive of defending and protecting the rights we inherited, and which it is our sacred duty to transmit unshorn to our children. That is one of the most beautiful paragraphs in this entire speech. We're not doing this in hostility to anyone in the North. We're not doing it to injure anybody in any other section. We're not doing it for our own benefit. We're doing it because this is right and because we have a duty to pass this on to our children. In other words, this tradition must survive. The tradition of American self-determination and independence has to survive. I find in myself perhaps a type of the general feeling of my constituents towards yours. I am sure I feel no hostility to you, senators from the North. I am sure there is not one of you, whatever sharp distinctions there may have been between us, to whom I cannot now say, in the presence of my God, I wish you well. And such, I am sure, is the feeling of the people whom I represent towards those whom you represent. I therefore feel that I but express their desire when I say I hope, and they hope, for peaceful relations with you, though we must part. Again, where's the vitriol? It's not here. Davis is simply saying, I bid you adieu, let's be friends. Don't attack us. Don't do it. There's no reason for it. They may be mutually beneficial to us in the future, as they have been in the past, if you so will it. The reverse may bring disaster on every portion of the country. And if you will have it thus, we will invoke the God of our fathers, who delivered them from the power of the lion, to protect us from the ravages of the bear, and thus, putting our trust in God and in our own firm hearts and strong arms, we will vindicate the right as best we may. In the course of my service here, associated at different times with a great variety of senators, I see now around me some with whom I have served long. There have been points of collision, but whatever of offense there has been to me, I leave here. I carry with me no hostile remembrance. Whatever offense I have given which has not been redressed, or for which satisfaction has not been demanded, I have, senators, in this hour of our parting, to offer you my apology for any pain which in heat of discussion I have inflicted. I go hence unencumbered of the remembrance of any injury received, and having discharged the duty of making the only reparation in my power for any injury offered. Mr. President and Senators, having made the announcement which this occasion seemed to me to require, it only remains for me to bid you a final adieu. This is a beautiful speech, and again, as I said at the beginning of this, people wept. People cheered. There was this moment of silence, and then people stood and cheered as Davis led the other senators from the states which were withdrawing that day out of the chamber. No vitriol, no hatred, just a simple statement. The people of Mississippi have said that we are out of the Union. I'm going to follow my state. I think it's the just thing to do. I think it's the American thing to do. And please, let's have peaceful relations. Let's be friends after this, just in separate countries now. We miss that part of all of this when we get on social media and people say such horrible things to each other about these issues. But this was the spirit that was pervasive in 1861, at least coming from the South. Now, Davis is pointing out there were people in the North who were advocating war. And he hoped that wouldn't happen, but they would defend themselves if they had to. But you're not going to see in any of this speech any kind of vitriol or hatred towards the North. And I think Davis's case on secession, his explanation of nullification, his peaceful wish to be left alone, certainly plays into the political culture and the culture, the overriding culture of the South, this natural freedom and this hegemonic liberty, which, of course, they were often proponents of. But you see it here. It's contained within this speech, which is why I think it's one of those essential Southern documents. See you next time on the Essential Southern Podcast.